Welcome. This is the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. Organizations survive over the long term because they can continually produce more profitable revenue. Those who make maximum profit do it because they first optimized a people-first culture. It's the people in the organization that create the value, that deal with the clients, that are the innovators. They're the ones who assure you of a long-term profitable culture. So today's going to be a little different. Those of you who are regular viewers realize that normally I interview some people out there in the real world doing work around creating and living revenue cultures. Since this is the first in our series for 2023, we're going to recap some things we learned from last year, and then we're going to preview some things that we believe are going to make a difference in 2023. And we hope we hear from you to, give us some additions or challenges or, just help us get better at living a revenue culture. So where we can start is with a recap. And there were some clear learnings from last year. And the first one was, black swans. Everybody wants to talk about black swans. And for those of us who practice living a revenue culture, we assume black swans are a regular thing. They're different regular things. Black swan can be an inflation issue. It can be a supply chain issue. It can be new technology. It can be a pandemic. It can be a 9/11. It can be a new shooting war between the Ukraine and the Russians. There is literally an unlimited number of black swan events. I think the big learning from last year and the guests we had on and from the market in general was to recognize that black swans show up differently depending on what kind of business you run. And those of you who follow revenue science know that businesses tend to get broken into two categories. One is a fulfillment category. And a fulfillment category is where the world gets up in the morning and says, I need to buy something. And you just happen to be one of the sellers of what the world gets up and wants to buy. And we watched during the pandemic that a lot of things that were really popular before the pandemic just weren't on people's lists during and to some degree after the pandemic. So if you were in a fulfillment business and the black swan redefined whether people wanted it or didn't, or under what conditions or what pricing they wanted it or didn't, your world could change quite rapidly. On the other hand, if you were in a value transfer business where you were very aware of the buyer and why the buyer valued what you do, and you knew that what you do makes the buyer's world better, and the buyer wants their world to get better, the pandemic or the supply chain or some of the others didn't impact you as much because people needed the high value things no matter what. And so when we think about black swans and we think about people who during the black swans drove me crazy when they would say, well, we're going to pivot. And pivot means you're going to stop going someplace. You're going to plant yourself in one spot and spin around. Well, the world isn't stopping with you. So when you stop and spin around, everything else is rushing past you. Now, if you're a fulfillment organization and people stop wanting you to fulfill, then maybe you do stop and spin around for a little while until you figure out what you're going to do next that you can fulfill for people. If you're a value provider, you may change a little bit if you're an education institution, you may change from people meeting in a class to meeting through Zoom. Or if you're a medical office, you may allow people to actually get prescriptions based on iPad interviews and other ways to take your vitals. So if you're really in a value business, you tend to keep going, although maybe in a different way. So two of the things, just looking back, that we learned were really important is recognize whether you're really in the high value business or you're in the fulfillment business. Because your revenue culture is probably very long term if you're in the value part of the business, and potentially quite short term if you're in the fulfillment business. So those were two recaps from 2022. The third one on the list is one of the ones that's been getting bigger and bigger for a number of years now, and that's big purpose. And in the revenue science language, big purpose means that what your organization does makes the world a better place. Doesn't necessarily mean you're saving the whales, or you're in the green area, or you're helping electrify all vehicles. Making the world better could be you're helping to decrease the cost of rentals for low-income families. It could be you help other businesses be more efficient and effective so they don't have to continually raise prices. It could be you've created a way to make less wasted food, and that the food that's not wasted can now feed the homeless. Big purpose means you're making the world better. And where that matters in the revenue culture is, of course, you get more margin typically. If you make a client's world better, they're normally happy to pay you for better, as opposed to a commodity where all they're trying to do is, save money they already have. When you're making their world better, you're helping them get new money. People like new money. It's better than just saving old money. But also the big purpose is very critical for your staff. We know there's no question going forward that the world is going to decrease in population, and certainly is already decreasing in population of working age, so that being able to attract the right buyer, the right employees, and keep them and help grow them through a long career becomes really, really important. And big purpose also almost compels people to come work for you. When your organization has a big purpose, and that big purpose is the genesis for the value you transfer to your buyer, what that really says is your employees, by helping your company make more money, by helping your company get and keep customers, they're doing good work. And if the purpose happens to be aligned with your employees' goals for themselves, and if they can fulfill their own life by helping your corporation deliver on its purpose, then everybody wins. And employees are much more likely to leave an organization where it's clear there's no purpose, there's no make anything better, and they're not treated well. When they're in an organization that has a big purpose, they can weather short-term disagreements or short-term confusion, and they're okay as long as the long-term is going someplace important, someplace they believe in. So big purpose matters. And it doesn't just matter with your customers and your employees, it also matters with your business partners and the community that you actually live in. And today our communities tend to be bigger than they used to be, because so many of us are global out of our living rooms or out of our small offices in a small town. So big purpose matters for all kinds of reasons, for all kinds of people. So one of the things 2022 made really clear is we all need to be aware of what our purpose is and use that as part of our conversation. And whatever it is, it's better that people understand it, that it's transparent, and that we live along with what our purpose is. We don't just say we have a purpose and then not live it, or we live it and don't let people know what it is. Both of those are losing situations. The fourth one is technology, and certainly the pandemic and some of the changes in the whole culture have driven the technology like crazy. We talked a second ago about universities teaching through Zoom or some other way. But this whole virtual way to do business has just shaken everybody up. And it's interesting, in the people we've interviewed and the client work we do, when we look at organizations that want their people back in the office, and then we talk to the people, the people struggle with, why do you want me back in the office? Is it you don't trust me? Is it that you want me to sit an hour each way in traffic? Is it the only way you know how to communicate is if you can look me in the eye face to face in the room? Or is it the only way you know how to manage is when you can look over my shoulder and tell me I forgot to dot an I? Leaders have a responsibility to support their teams. And in many cases, supporting your team is not bringing them back in the office. There's research that's pretty clear that organizations that have no meeting days, that at least in the early research, 3 no meeting days out of 5 creates the most work possible. If you have 4 meeting days, the work decreases. If you have 2 no meeting days, the work decreases. So we've got to figure out how to manage our organizations, and that includes our relationships with our customers and our partners, based on some of the new technology offers. And this is like everything else, that no matter what we do, some people are going to love it and some people are going to hate it. So the trick is, let's figure out what it is that actually improves our revenue culture, that actually helps our team be more productive, be more satisfied, be more compelled to show up at work every day and be engaged, and not worry about where they do it. I mean, if it makes a difference, then it matters. If it doesn't make a difference, don't worry about it. So technology, we look at sales, and sales in the last 10 years has gone from, sales is kind of the most important part of revenue generation, to, well, then there was sales enablement. Now there's sales operations. And as a history buff, what I'm watching is the transition from sales to revenue generation. So when we talk about living a revenue culture, of course sales is important, but sales is an element in that culture. It's not the culture. So, that really leads to number 5, is we've learned that the roles in organizations are vastly different. They're different in a number of ways. One of them is they're different from even 5 years ago, even in 2019, even 3 years ago. They're different, partially because of technology, partially because the buyer's world has changed. And when we think about a revenue culture, we better be thinking about that culture being intimate with the buyers. And so if the buyer's world has changed, and I think we can all agree it has changed drastically, then we have to ask, has our selling organization, has our revenue organization changed to transfer more value, or are we not paying attention to the value, or haven't we changed at all? So roles going forward need to change, if for no other reason, because the buyers are changing, but also because the technology is changing. And technology that was either non-existent or difficult 4 or 5 or 10 years ago today is pretty normal. So we need to tie 4 and 5 together, that, the technology is changing, the roles need to be changing, and we need to make sure all of that is aligned to those ideal buyers that really are the ones who pay us, and make sure that our organization exists. So number 6, it's interesting when we read all the books we read, and we read the research, and we listen to consultants speak, we need to pay attention to whether their examples or their research or their message is about business to business or business to consumer, or if what they're talking about actually applies to both. Some things certainly do apply to both, maybe not nearly as many as a lot of us think, but we need to at least ask the question, is this a conversation that's true for B2B, B2C, or both? Because often, particularly in the marketing space today, many of the really effective marketing campaigns around social media and digital really work well in B2C and not so well in B2B. And the ones that do work in B2B probably are too complex and too expensive for B2C. So those of us who are in this living a revenue culture world, we need to be careful that one size doesn't fit all, and that there's a real difference between B2B and B2C. The number 7 is talking about unity versus pivot. And we talked about this a little bit up in 1 and 2, but very few leaders talk about, how do I unify my team? How do I get my team so that, it's, if we use a sports analogy, we often see, a basketball team that has 3 spectacular players, by history. They're all going to be Hall of Famers, but they don't play well together. They don't look at the game the same way. They don't strategize the game the same way. Business is the same thing. Many times we hire because this person is a great CFO or a great salesperson. And of course that's important. But what's even more important is, do these people, are they going to work well with everybody else in the organization? Hopefully one of the things you saw in our 2022 interviews was the importance of the different parts of organizations to all work together and understand, even speak the same revenue language. Talk about managing flow, talk about the right focus on being buyer back as opposed to headquarters out. So we need to get our organizations unified. Otherwise, we end up with a high cost of chaos. We end up with almost a guaranteed we can't scale scenario. And so we don't want to sit there and just say, something's broke, let's pivot and figure out something new. What we really want to talk about is, how do I hired all smart people. How do I get these smart people to work as a unit, to be unified? And I don't want them just unified internally. I want them unified with our customers. I want them unified with our ideal buyers. I want them unified in the community that we work in. So unification of a team, and we'll talk a little later about directional unification, is critical if we want to remove the cost of chaos and have people like coming to work. It's not fun to come to work when you're competing with all of your peers. It'd be a whole lot more fun if you were competing against the world or your competitors outside your organization, or if you were competing to create the greatest value possible for the buyer. So if you want to compete, there's ways to compete, but competing with your own team members, all you're doing is you're using team resources going in two different directions and you're competing with each other. That's adding to the chaos. So that unity versus pivoting is something to think about. If you got to pivot all the time, you better take a step back and ask yourself why. What kind of culture am I creating? Probably every time you pivot, you're losing some pretty good people. And some of the other people are just sitting there going, I have no idea what's happening. I'm going to step back. So number 8, the last one on the recap, is recession is a time for unified revenue culture. For those of you who have really done a good job, and I hope there's a lot of you, in developing a revenue culture, when we have, whether it's recession, whether it's supply chain, whether it's inflation, whether it's pandemic, if we really have a revenue culture where we've optimized our culture first, the people will be able to take what the market gives us and figure out, how do I make the most money possible out of this new situation? How do I take the things we're really good at, the things where we add value, and modify them in a way, because we often forget your business model in many cases is as important or more important than your product or service. So this is really about letting your culture figure out how to take your business model to a new level so that it goes beyond just your product or service and it creates new value. When this happens in a bad economy, and people seem to think 2023 is going to start out bad anyway, and you can actually unify your team. This is when you get your competition's best employees, when you get their best customers, and maybe sometimes you just flat out buy them. So think about unifying your culture in these tough economies and let your team help you solve the problems and help you turn those problems into new opportunities, because we look back in history and we see companies that come out of these recessions come out like rockets. So you got to figure out how to be a rocket and come out of that recession. So now let's take a look at a preview of 2023. And the first thing to think about, because it's getting to the point that it's so obvious we can't ignore it, and that's directional unification based on your big purpose. What that directional unification means is that you want everybody on your team, and your team, remember, is your investors, your leadership, your regular day-to-day employees doing the work, your business partners, and the community you work in, and of course your customers. You want all of them unified to your purpose. So if you're spending a lot of time with any of those groups that are not unified around your big purpose, you're throwing away time and money, but more than that, you're confusing everybody else. If people believe they know who you are and where you're going and what you stand for, but then on a day-to-day basis you don't act like that, then that's a challenge. And when you have that unification directional, not I know exactly what we're going to do because we're going to do it the same way we did last year. Well, that doesn't work because last year is so different than this year. You're going to kill yourself. So you need to have everybody know where you're going. And every day you're going to make some new decisions. And you're going to do some new things. And you're going to do them whether you want to or not. So you might as well do them and keep them aligned to the direction where you're trying to go that support your big purpose. So start to build your culture around directional unification so that every time that people that are part of your team, your whole overall culture, are confronted with a new situation, they're making a decision that's consistent with your direction. That's what you want them to do, because when they do that, they're continually improving your culture. So number 2 is very aligned to that, and that's identify a true north and create a graphic for it so your team recognizes here's where we're going, and help your team identify those things that when they do them, when they act that way, when they have these conversations, they're going north. And if they're having another set of conversations, which they can help you identify also, your team can help you do this, then you're going south. And going north is always adding value to your customer and margin to yourself, and south is subtracting value to your customer and margin to yourself. So you can create a simple graphic that says this is our true north. Now imagine you apply that when you're hiring, so that you're hiring people and you're showing them, here's our true north. This is where we go, and this is how we act. A simple one is every company, every person in every company, every day gets to decide, do you make money from your customer or with your customer? Now, from your customer means, I'm going to jack up my price and hope they don't notice. I'm going to do win-lose negotiation. I'm going to be there for wallet share, and I'm going to be there for upsell and cross-sell. I don't care if they need it. If I can sell it to them, I'm okay. On the other hand, if you want them to make money with the client, then they're there to help transfer more value, help solve problems for the buyer, the problems that bring value that the buyer will pay you for, and that you're making investments of time or money or your own education, you're continuously improving yourself going north. So figure out how to help your team know what the right decisions are. And as you listen to a number of the interviews in 2022, you saw people are doing that. We just need a lot more of them to be doing that. So number 3 is a continuation of 1 and 2. I think it's Microsoft originally made the statement that human beings make 35,000 decisions a day. So I'm sure a lot of them are heart deciding whether it's going to beat or not, but I'm told 850 of those 35,000 are about what we're going to eat. That doesn't surprise me. That's all kind of sounds small. But what it really tells us is, we use an example of a salesperson. And the salesperson knows they have a new customer to talk to in the morning. So do they decide this afternoon to go hang out with their buddies at the tavern, and tomorrow when they call the customer, they'll just kind of wing it? Or do they spend the next half an hour doing research on who the client is or the prospect is, and what's their company all about, and what's their LinkedIn profile, and where did they work before, and really preparing for that call in the morning so that it's really you're as knowledgeable about that potential buyer as you can be. Now, that's the kind of decision we all make all the time. Do we return the phone call we just got today or tomorrow? When we got this email, do I just forward it to somebody else and hope they take care of it, or do I make sure it gets done? We make a lot of decisions, and those decisions are, they have an additive function. It's kind of like in investments, we think about compounding interest or compounding, our profits from an investment into future investments. These decisions are the same way. If we get our culture to continually make those positive decisions going forward, those add up over time. And 2 things are happening. One is we're continually adding more and more value for which we will get paid. The other one is we're continually changing our organization. When we make those decisions, all of a sudden it becomes cultural, that we always fully research a prospect before we call them. That we always return phone calls the same day, that we always make sure emails got fully answered by us or by somebody else. That really changes the culture of our organization. Number 4, this is a personal preference, and from what I'm reading and some of the people I'm talking to, I think this is going to be a big deal in 23 and forward. And that is waste is our enemy. Whether it's wasting natural resources, whether it's wasting water or oil or food, or whether it's wasting time or wasting money. Our enemy is going to be waste. And, we've been blessed, at least in North America, with an abundance of things. But waste is going to hurt all of us if we're not careful. So I'm hopeful that we'll have many conversations next year about making decisions to avoid waste, intentional decisions to avoid waste. Because often it's like those 35,000 decisions. Maybe we really have 4 or 5 choices, and one of them is really simple, but there's a lot of waste. Another one is maybe just a little more work, but there's no waste in it, and we don't pay for it in the long term. So hopefully we're going to be focused in 2023 on eliminating some waste. Okay, number 5, a full revenue culture is critical. And the people that we interviewed in 2023 repeatedly made this clear, that nobody succeeds in a vacuum. And it's only when we think we do that we really get in trouble. But when we recognize how important that whole culture is, that from our investors, through our leadership, through our team doing the delivery, to our buyers, to our partners, and to our community, when we get all of those players focused on the same big purpose, we actually think about each other as teammates, we actually recognize we're all culturally connected to each other, all of a sudden we can have a whole lot better operation. When we look at great companies, at least great companies while they're great, they almost always have those kinds of links and bonds between the different members of their culture. Number 6, this one's just starting to peak. It's interesting, Drucker said it 40 years ago or 50 years ago. He talked about the only purpose of a business is to acquire and keep customers. And so he said 50 years ago, it's really about the buyer. The buyer's the one who determines our value. The buyer's the one who either buys from us or doesn't, and they determine how much they'll pay us for what we do. And they determine whether or not they'll help us get better. So we need to change our organizations from headquarters out to buyer back. This is a really hard one because we weren't brought up this way. We were brought up to think about Wall Street and short-term returns and returns for the investors, not how to make the buyers' worlds better. And the internet's flipped all that. The buyer says, the heck with you. I don't care how much money you guys make. I care about whether my world gets better when I do business with you. So we need to really think about how to be buyer back. And that's part of the reason, recognizing that the buyer's part of your culture. And if you don't think the buyer's part of your culture, you're always going to be headquarters out. So hopefully we really start to talk about and build business models where the buyer is intentionally part of what we do. Then number 7, and this was another hard one for people, is recognizing that your business model is often more valuable than your product or service. Particularly if your product or service is a commodity product or service, people often care much more about how it is to do business with you, how easy you make it, and how trusting they are of you. Those things become much more important than the product or service. But by the same token, the business model has a huge amount to do with your employees. So it's not just about, does the business model help the end buyer? It's about, does the business model make the place a compelling place to work? As an employee, am I fulfilling personal goals by working here? Do I feel good about myself? Am I happy to be part of this team? Am I proud to say this is where I work? So for 2023 and beyond, we got to think about our business models, because that's a really critical part of creating and transferring value. And then number 8, I'd love to have each of you suggest additional podcast guests. So please think about who I could be interviewing in 2023 that maybe they impact some of the things on this page, and maybe they do some new stuff I haven't even thought about. So if you or somebody that you know would be a great guest, please reach out and let me know, because good guests are fun. And I love to have good guests who have new ideas or new views of things. Even if they don't have a way to fix it, just the fact they see it and maybe with greater clarity, or the ability to define it so that you get an aha out of just their definition. So please think about who else should be on these podcasts and let me know. And if you have additional topics or subjects that you can think of that are part of living a revenue culture, I want to hear about that as well. So I want to thank you for being with us for, this is actually our third calendar year. We aren't to a third year yet, but we're into it. And so I want to thank you for being with us. And please reach out and share anything you've got. We'd love to hear it. Have a great 2023, and I hope I see you a lot.